So for the distinction, which is D3, we need to start our report talking about which sugar we would use to produce optimum growth conditions. So we're going to maybe just start a bit of an introduction, so we just remind ourselves for our distinction. We've got yeast, and this is using sugar, and for example, it could be using it in aerobic respiration. So sugar plus oxygen would give carbon dioxide plus water, and that's the sort of thing. If you're baking bread and using yeast, the CO2 produced will produce bubbles in the dough and make the dough rise. It might be anaerobic respiration, like making beer or wine. So you could discuss that. And we've got different sugars, and so just to recap our best sugar for growth. Our best sugar for growth based on our data was sucrose. So we're just going to remind ourselves again about that. So the best sugar for growth is sucrose. And we need to just have a discussion about, well, okay, we're going to suggest sucrose for growth, but when we're growing this commercially, we need to take into account some things like the table we've got here, which is attached to which is your cost per kilogram, and you can see that some sugars are pretty expensive and some sugars are cheaper. So even though sucrose is the best for growth, is that going to be commercially viable? So let's just have a look at some of these sugars. So we got sucrose gave 100% increase, and how expensive is it? It's pretty cheap. So it's also the cheapest sugar to buy. If we were comparing it against some other sugars, so which gave the next best increase? So maltose, that had a 39% increase. But if you look at the costs, 134 pounds per kilogram, so very expensive to use. And then you might think that glucose is a good suggestion. So glucose, but that only gave 15%. So only gave 15% increase, and also it's not the cheapest at £7. Also not the cheapest at £7 per kilogram. So we're going for sucrose, 100% an increase, also the cheapest to buy at £5 per kilogram. And really just to fill this out a bit, you could also look at some extra information. You could look at some research on yeast, and previously I've asked you to find out about the structures and sugars. So sugar structures, and sources. So for example, you could tell us about glucose, find the structure of glucose, which will look something like this. You could find out whether they are, so you got the yeast, you got the different sugars, and some are monosaccharides or disaccharides. So yeast, where's it found? What are its uses? And we talked about bread, making beer and wine, and so on. And there are some other uses as well. Things like Marmite and things like that. Talk about sugars, and then you've got your discussion about costs, and that should be enough for the distinction.